Most people probably know Odin as a language for game development, but one thing I've been really interested in exploring is what would it look like to use Odin for infrastructure or web related projects. That is part of the reason I built Tina, a concurrency framework in Odin, and more recently Tina HTTP, which is a HTTP server library built on top of Tina core primitives. The goal wasn't to recreate existing web stacks one to one, but rather to make something that I would feel fun working in. So in this video, I'm going to show some demos, walk through a little bit of code, explain some of the ideas behind Tina or Tina HTTP, and then give people interested in Odin web development something interesting for them to experiment with and build on. So there are a couple of examples in the repo which you find on GitHub. And here I'm going to start with one of the HTTP examples, say the SSE, the server sent events to show the streaming use case. And here, like this. So we see it started. I'll close the terminal and open this in the browser. So here you can see um, the data coming in from the server. And if we open another tab and do the same thing, we see the counters are being synchronized between the tabs. I'll stop the server, which you see disconnected, and then restart it, and then you can see they are back up again with the same timer. And if I refresh, one of them starts from the last counter and goes on that way. So how does this all work on the back end? So the HTTP package is built on Tina concurrency framework, which it's the basis of concurrency is what it calls an isolate. So if you're familiar with actors, so isolate is will be synonymous to an actor, or but more closely related to Erlang's processes, yeah, if you know that. So there's no async await, no coroutines here. They are just stackless handlers that give you explicit state transition so you can do what you want. And the way the HTTP library is built is on top of the isolate. So there's a listener isolate, which is the one that listens for network TCP or socket request, and then starts up the accepts the connections and then sends the message to a connection isolate, which does all the passing and routing and also the response handling. So every new request comes in through the handler and listener rather, and then the message is sent via the mailbox system to the connection, and then that carries on. So a simple example you can see here, you define a route that takes in a request and response object, as you see here, and then you configure the app for how many for the routes you want, then the actual server. And because the HTTP library is an extra package, you have to add a specification, or rather like a boot time spec for it to Tina, the core framework, because that is how the framework knows how to set up the pre-allocate memory for use. As you saw from the startup, let me switch open the terminal again so you can see. As you can see in the terminal, there it does a couple of memory allocations, and here we try to see a highlight of what is being allocated and how much. That is how what this function does when they are being connected. I would like to show a different example. In this case, a server-side rendered HTML application, or rather what some people call the multi-page app. So I will switch back to my terminal, and in this case I would run this and go to the browser, refresh. So what you see here is a HTTP rendered, sorry, a server-side rendered HTML page, with a footer as you scroll, a rather header on navigation bars, and then a footer that changes based on the page. If you go to about, there's an about, you know, you can see that it's returning the HTML. So how does that work? So in this case, I have a private package for personal use which does HTML rendering for me. And in this case, in this example, it uses the HTML render library to render HTML elements on the server side, in Odin. There is no string template in here. You can see how it looks like. So here it's just a way for me to determine this which page to show. I have a render layout, so it uses a sort of component system, or rather you can create functions that look like components. And here I have a function called render layout that uses the HTML library to render the HTML content, and including the navigation bar, the footer, and also the main body content. And here you can see how the navigation is rendered, basically calling this render nav link here, which has a span element and a couple of properties to detect if it's active or not. Um, this is my own personal experiment. I think it's quite nice. I wanted to avoid a system where I don't need to deal with HTML template strings, or try to make like a different kind of string formatting library. Wanted everything to look like a function, strongly typed with Odin as the compiler, and possibility to also um, either pre-compile strings or do them at startup. And this feels um, much more usable for me at the moment. We'll see how it goes in the future. And here we have the footer, and then we have the different page component. This one renders for the home page, this for the about page, and they all compose nicely. And when we go down to these are the server routes here, and they use the HTML writer library to call render layout, which returns the buffer, which is what is being written to as the to the HTTP response here. Those are all fixed output. And for the contact page, it's also pre-rendered. So if you coming from the JavaScript land and you prefer doing things or pre-rendering things at the server, you can do them here. So the buffer is allocated at startup, and then when it starts off, it's the function is run to pre-render the page, and then we define the server routes here, and then start up the solution, and this is how it goes rendered to the page, all looking, in my opinion, very nice and functional, I would say, and also built in using the HTTP framework. So this is private, so it doesn't limit you to only HTML. You can build any kind of solution you want, create your own libraries on top of Tina to do things like reaching out to a database, um, having like a background service that takes some work based on HTTP request. Those are all possible for you to try. So when whenever you get a chance, check out the code. It's on GitHub. Um, on this URL, I'll drop the link in the comment, and feel free to check it out.